Welcome back to the Spotlight.
Thank you, Dave. It's always my pleasure.
No, the pleasure is mine, and I am very happy to have you back. I think the last time I had you on here was like December of 2019. So it's been a while, and now we're in this pandemic, and you are out in Hawaii. And I just wanted to get your take on what is going on, how you've been handling it out in Hawaii, what's been going on, and what you think this is.
Okay, well, thanks for the question, Dave. And I realize, Hawaii is a unique state because we're out in the middle of the Pacific, right? 2,400 miles from California, and so the state acted very aggressively and basically shut down tourism. And so there's very few flights coming in, very few people, from 30,000 tourists a day arriving to less than 1,000. And this is actually what's interesting about Hawaii is, it's very dependent on tourism, right? It's basically got defense spending in Pearl Harbor and Hickam Air Force Base, and then it's got tourism, and it's the rest of its economy's been stripped away. It used to have a lot of agriculture. That's been basically lost. And so a lot of people are looking at this situation and saying, maybe we should reinvent tourism, because when I arrived as a teenager, there was 1 million tourists a year had arrived in Hawaii, and that was some big, big landmark, 1 million tourists. Well, last year it was 10.5 million. So, like a lot of places that depend on tourism, and you're in Florida, so you can speak to that. Hawaii is a small space, and a lot of it is mountainous, and so it's actually a really narrow band of habitable territory for the 1.5 million residents and the 10.5 million tourists. And so, people are starting to rethink tourism and say, maybe we don't need 10 million people. Maybe we should scale the thing back, and maybe we should reinvent local agriculture, And so I see this as a very positive thing. It's kind of like a reset. And the word I keep using is reinvention, meaning that America just badly needs to reinvent its economy and its social structure. And this is an opportunity if we take it. So people here are, they're actually not anxious to return to the old normal of, everything's overcrowded, the infrastructure's, under stress. And I guess I'll end with a comment that I'm reading that other places around the world that were totally dependent on tourism and overcrowded and stressed out. It's like people are delighted that tourism is dead, because they said we get our city back. That's what people said in Amsterdam, Barcelona, these cities that were just overwhelmed, overrun with tourists. The residents felt like they'd lost their city. And so, that may not be what the happy story is officially, but that's the gut feeling of people here.
Do you think people are looking at the economy, looking at the Constitution, their way of life differently now between pre-pandemic and post-pandemic?
It's a great question, Dave, and I, of course, I'm just an observer. I'm just like everybody else, reading what I can. But it seems I just saw a statistic out of the UK this morning that 40% of the people felt that they'd made progress on rethinking their lives, as a result of the shutdown. And so I think this kind of space, because American life is so busy, right? A lot of people are over busy. They're addicted to their cell phone. They're stressed out by financial worries, getting the kids to preschool, on and on, right? And so having a chance to pull back from that and question the old normal and ask themselves, well, maybe the new normal could be better for me personally somehow. How would that work? I think that's a positive, despite the many negatives that we're experiencing in terms of loss of income, higher surveillance, this sort of authoritarian, petty authoritarianism that we're seeing. Those are the negatives, but I see a silver lining in people being able to rethink their lives.
Yeah, because of this whole pandemic, we've seen certain individuals, come out of the shadows and take the spotlight. Bill Gates is one of them. But we've seen many agendas because now they are pushing certain things. And we've been talking about this for quite a while, about certain agendas where they would like everyone vaccinated. They would like everyone to have papers to go to work. They would like total surveillance. They would like all these, remove all the Constitution. They would like all these different things. And it seems once this hit, all these actors came out and they started to push their agenda. Do you think people are waking up to that, actually seeing it now and questioning what their true motive is?
Yeah, I certainly hope so, Dave. And there's quite a bit of evidence that people are questioning certain of these agendas, especially the ones that impact them directly. Right. That's the only time we really start caring about these very large scale, centralized, authoritarian agendas is when they impact us. Right. And so now it's impacting people, and they are questioning it. Um, and as they should. What's the danger, which is really unfortunate, but that's where we're at in this cycle of American history, is it's now been extremely polarized. Everything is now polarized politically in America. So, it's almost like you cannot root for your home team. Whoop, you're a conservative, you're a Trump supporter, or you're a progressive, right? I mean, it's like everything has been polarized, to the point where we can't talk about the pandemic without being labeled either pro-Trump or progressive. And it's like there's no middle ground left in America to discuss these things, and that's unfortunate. So when I when I listen to you and my other um, alternative media, hosts, I'm that's what I'm hopeful for, is we're trying to create a middle ground where we can discuss this stuff openly without being labeling people, you're bad because you're X or Y, right? So that's my sort of lead in to say we do need to, to have a middle ground where we can say what are the agendas that are being placed, and they're not political, they're not like pro-Trump or progressive, they're simply agendas created by these centralized organizations. And I would say, and I've written many books about it, that centralization is itself the disease. In other words, once you give a small group of people in the NSA or in the federal government or some agency a tremendous amount of power, they're going to exercise that power. And that's their sort of tropism, if you will. In other words, that's the way they're aimed. That's the way they think. That's the mindset of their organization is, well, we should be in control of everything, because if we're not in control of everything, something might slip through our fingers. And so, just, my example of how this plays out is the NSA, right? And we all know, because of Ed Snowden's revelations, that that on right after 9/11, then the NSA was given these blanket, totally unconstitutional powers to listen in on every phone call, every tweet, everything that was happening digitally in the United States. They were scooping up all this data and analyzing it in total violation of the Constitution, right? And that got sort of massaged away as, oh well, we need to do this, right? And so here we go, pandemic, we need to do this again, right? And we see that all over the place.
You said something about centralization, about how everything's centralized in government or with the central bank or globalists. And it seems that in government, they wanted everything centralized to a few organizations to keep tabs and to watch over the people. And these are not elected leaders. These are people who are employed by the government. And the elected leaders, they're the ones who are responsible for making policy, checking up on things. They report to the people. And these people in government, like the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, all these other individuals, and, the DNI, all these individuals, all the ambassadors, all these other people are just employees, and they shouldn't have certain agendas. They're saying, oh, it should be this way, because they're not the elected people. They are the employees of the government, and they can be hired and fired by the elected officials. So I know we went through this whole impeachment. We went through the declassification of a lot of documents, and we're starting to learn that these individuals, they have a certain agenda. It's time to take a magnifying glass and look at all these individuals to see what they've really been up to over the many, many years.
Absolutely. And we know that they're afraid of us learning what they've actually been doing, hence the tremendous efforts put in suppressing any whistleblowers, right? And that's in big corporations, that's in government agencies, that's across the entire spectrum of American life. Whistleblowers are hunted to the ends of the earth, right? Why? Because they're releasing extremely dangerous material. I would just wanted to make the point that when we talk about national security, it's like the NSA and, the alphabet, agencies, it's all, they think that national security is searching through all of our billions of phone calls, tweets, posts, etc., and seeking some connection to some shadow, terrorist organization. Meanwhile, they're missing what actually is national security. The nation's security is based on maintaining civil liberties and a viable social contract. And the social contract's fraying because of the tremendous concentration of wealth and power in the hands of the few at the expense of the many, right? That's your national security. Nobody cares about that. That's eroding fast, right? That's why we're so politically polarized, is America doesn't work anymore for the bottom 95%. It only works now for the top 5%. And the basis of national security is civil liberties. Maintaining that is our national security. So there's this weird sort of psychotic Orwellian thing where they're stripping away everything that makes the nation secure under the guise of protecting us, our national security. So it's actually they're destroying the nation while they're claiming to protect it. It's kind of like that Vietnam War era thing where to save the village, we had to destroy it. And that's the environment that we're in because of centralized power and wealth.
And I mean, since we're talking about centralized power, we also have a central bank that is centralized, where, again, the Federal Reserve, it's not part of the government. It's a private corporation, and the creation of currency is coming out of the Federal Reserve, which is a private corporation, which is then being loaned to the government. Yes, the Treasury trades Treasury bonds for this. And I know the other banks, they also have the ability to create this type of currency and put it out into the market. But the question is, since this pandemic, a lot of people are looking at centralization. They're looking at supply chains. They're looking at the globalist model. And because of what happened, people are now starting to think to themselves, well, maybe it wasn't a good idea to have everything centralized in China. Maybe it wasn't a good idea to move all our manufacturing over to there, because we're starting to see Europe, we're starting to see Japan, even the United States. Apple moved their company out, 20% of it, I believe, out into India. Japan has been calling back their corporation. So I think what's happening right now, people are looking at this situation, and I think this is a wake-up call right now that we need to start to change things.
Really glad you brought this whole topic of supply chains and globalization up, because, of course, I've been pounding on the financialization and globalization have been hollowing out the U.S. economy for decades, right? And now that's created a very fragile economy because we're so dependent on these long supply chains. And if we look at it like as a system, so-called systems analysis, what we're looking at is a system that's called tightly bound, meaning that all the pieces are like dominoes, and there's all these lines of dominoes, but they all intersect. And so if one line of dominoes falls, it triggers collapse of all the other lines of dominoes. And because it goes through a node that everything shares. And so this is like a system which is intrinsically fragile and vulnerable to any disruption. And so because these long supply chains worked in terms of lowering the price, right? So corporations could make the most money. Then everybody said, oh, well, that's all that counts is the low price and high profits, right? And I call it the tyranny of price. In other words, if all you're going to look at is the final price tag, you're going to miss out on everything that's intangible, that's actually very valuable. And control of your supply chain is actually very valuable, but it's not on the price tag, right? It's like your food. If all your food's flown in 3,000 miles on an airliner, and suddenly that stops for some reason, and you are starving, then you say, oh, but it was cheaper by a dime. Well, how important is that dime now when you don't have any food? Right. And so that's where our system has lost the ability to price in intangible capital. That's the way I would put it. In other words, there's a value to controlling your food supply, your energy supply, and your supply chains. And now we're recognizing, gosh, there's a value to that. How much is that worth? Well, you can't really put a price tag on it. I would say it's worth trillions of dollars, but it's not in any of the price tags, So that's where we're sort of having to make an assessment that's outside of our normal way of saying what's value. Value is price and profits. No, value is control.
Throughout this pandemic, what I've found very interesting is that, and I don't know if people realize this, I think people that listen to me realize it, but while this was happening, we were creating ventilators here. I know Trump has the Defense Production Act, and he forced companies to create ventilators. And of course, we didn't need any of these ventilators, very few of them, but we have thousands and thousands of ventilators. But what happened with that is that all of a sudden, we are now manufacturers of ventilators. All of a sudden, we are now manufacturers of masks. All of a sudden, we are now now manufacturers of testing. And with this warp speed agenda, it looks like we're going to be the manufacturers of pharmaceutical drugs. And I know there's vaccines mixed into this, but there's also therapeutics and other medications that are going to be involved. And when I look at this, it looks like we've just moved the medical supply chain out of China and into the US without anyone really noticing this, because now we manufacture all this stuff.
It's actually happened sort of under the radar. And I think another thing that's we're starting to see some news. I don't know if you're seeing it in Florida, but I'm seeing articles about the emergence of small farms. Suddenly, these small farmers that were close to urban areas that were sort of struggling to survive, suddenly they're now seen as a valuable resource, and people are glomming onto this farm to table model where the farms are just supplying, bringing boxes of produce and delivering them to consumers directly, not through warehousing or wholesalers or any of that stuff. And so it's working for everybody. In other words, this was a model that was kind of in the background for a number of years, but now it's like, hey, this is great. The farmer's making a few more bucks because they don't have to go through a wholesaler, and the consumer gets fresh produce directly and delivered to their door, et cetera. And so it's all like, my point here is to support your idea, which is there's a lot of things that can happen that are positive, that can happen quickly because the pieces are actually already here if we implement it.
Now, with the economy, I know that the country, not just the country, but the world, it was shut down. I mean, I don't think we've ever seen anything like this, even during the Depression, where we purposely shut down the entire economic system. If you told me, a year ago, 2 years ago, that, hey, by the way, they're just going to shut everything down. Nobody's going to be able to go to work. No one's going to be able to go to restaurants, and not just here in the U.S., but around the world, I would think you're crazy. But it happened. Everything was shut down, and now the economy now has to be rebooted. Do you think it's possible to reboot this system right now and get it up and running again, since we were shut down and the world was shut down?
Well, it's a great question, and I'm going to answer it in two ways, which I hope won't be too confusing. Is for me, I look at it like, again, from low orbit, and I'm looking at it going, you know what? If our economy wasn't so fragile, we should have been able to survive 6 to 8 weeks, and the fact that everything is crumbling so fast, to me, it's an indication of how fragile the economy was. People don't have any savings. Governments don't have any, rainy day funds or a pittance. And so, in other words, we spend and borrow everything, right? We're in debt. If we need something, we borrow the money. We have no savings as a country, right? Not as households, not as businesses, not as local governments. We got no savings at all. We spend every cent we get, and if we need more, we borrow it. And that's why debt has been skyrocketing for 20 years, right? Corporate, household, you name it, right? Government debt. And so it's kind of like, well, wait a minute, this should have been a wake-up call that we can't even survive for a few weeks without having to borrow trillions. And so that's not a healthy economy, all right? The one thing that's lost in my mind from American history is Americans are good at reinventing themselves when there's no other choice. And so if you go back to the revolutionary era of 1790s, if you go back to the 1830s, I mean, any kind of generational look at American history is we get to these crises points and then we have to reinvent ourselves, and that's when positive change occurs. So I don't really think it's a good thing to look at the old normal, December 2019 as a good model. I think we can do better. And unfortunately, there's going to be massive creative destruction of industries that just didn't work anymore, right? And so I'll give you one example: retail and office space, right? Statistically, America had 5 times more retail commercial space per person than Europe, right? 5 times more. We had so many malls and retail spaces, and the same goes for commercial space for offices. Huge numbers of millions and millions of square feet were built because somebody was trying to make a profit, not because we actually needed all that. And now with remote work and working from home being seen as a positive, right? It's really positive if you don't have a 3-hour commute anymore. There's just a lot of benefits to it. Yep. So then what are we going to do with all this space that we don't need anymore, because there was too much of it in the first place? So everybody that says, "Oh, we need to go back to life exactly as it was," it's all like, well, actually, it wasn't really working that well. So let's reinvent the industries that need reinventing, and there's going to be some creative destruction.
It sounds like we're going through a transition and people are waking up to the fact that the economy is not the same anymore, that things are going to change. Do you believe that we're in a transition period where people are now looking at the economy very, very differently?
I think so, and I think it's a positive transition because there's a lot of inefficiencies, and we have too much power and wealth in corporate monopolies and cartels, and it's not really serving the public anymore. So yeah, I think the transition will be a positive one.
Do you think the economy, not just here in the United States, but around the world, can it get back up and running? Because we've been shut down. I mean, we've never saw a shutdown before. We've never experienced a shutdown before like this. We've had recessions, we had depressions, but this was a man-made shutdown. Since
Right.
it was man-made, is this considered a real typical recession or depression?
Dave, and I would say no, it's not a typical depression or recession, and not only because of the reason you said, which is it's totally human made. It's revealed all these structural fragilities, like we talked about the supply chain, we talked about petty authoritarianism. It's kind of like revealed all the monster id of America, like the things that don't work. That's what's been revealed, right? In my view, part of what's been revealed, and it was a catalyst, but the problems existed before the pandemic, and so they've simply become more visible, like the thing I mentioned about the excess commercial space. But we can say the same thing about healthcare. The fact that healthcare was just completely unaffordable and wasn't working for the bottom 95%. You could look at higher education, unaffordable, not working, requiring almost 2 trillion in student loan debt. These systems were broken. Broken. And now people are wondering, and I think it's a good thing, is there some better way to organize this industry or sector? And that's going to cause tremendous pain in the entrenched interests, the vested interests who want to go back to the exact same status quo. But I think we're looking at these huge industries and saying, no, they have to change. Because they weren't working for the American public. And that'll be a very difficult transition because all those vested interests who were benefiting from those systems, they're gonna be out the door. They're gonna have less power, less wealth, less control as things are reordered.
So if we do make these changes, and let's say we get rid of the Federal Reserve, and we go to what the founding fathers wanted, where we're creating our own currency, and we transition into this new system. In your view, what would be a system that would work for the people? Like, what type of economy would work for the people?
Well, I think the key, in my view, and is what we were discussing earlier in the program, which is a radical decentralization, and to start valuing something other than just the price of a product or service. So, for instance, in a decentralized economy, which is the way that America used to be, there's a whole network of local manufacturers, suppliers, growers, and those people have created a lot of jobs. And so when you have a supply chain that's moved out of the country, and you have Walmart destroying the entire town's retail sector, so it's just everybody goes to Walmart and buys this stuff from China, you've lost a lot more than just control of your supply chain. You've lost the job creation, which is decentralized economies, right? And you've lost local wealth. In other words, when the wealth flows to Walmart central headquarters or Google's central headquarters and to manufacturers in China, that means that's every dollar doesn't stay in the local economy. And so we need to decentralize and relocalize, and then the money that's made in the local economy and spent in the local economy stays in the local economy and helps to support jobs, because that's really what we want. Is we want jobs that are meaningful, and maybe we're going to make less money. Maybe we're not going to be able to pay everybody the same salary they used to have, but their work would be meaningful and in their community. And I think that's part of what I see as a solution.
And what happens if we move towards getting rid of the central bank? I mean, since we're talking about changing the globalist model, if we remove the central bank, which is the Federal Reserve, and we go back to sound money, I'm not talking about, we're going to have, dollars which are convertible into gold. Maybe the system might be backed by gold, but not convertible into gold. But if we go back to a system where we're not borrowing, currency from a central bank, how would that change the economy?
Well, that's a huge topic, Dave, and I'm glad you brought that up. The way we have it now is just the system is incredibly unfair. It's wired to be unfair. There's no other way for it to be except unfair, which is the central bank creates the money, hands it to the financiers, banks, and huge, monopoly corporations at near zero interest rates, and then they get to buy up all the assets of the nation. And that's why, 90% of the stock market's owned by the top, sliver of society. So that's just completely unfair. So if we started other competing ways of creating money, that would level the playing field. And so my personal favorite is a labor-backed currency, a digital currency, sort of like a Bitcoin that was created not by mining the way Bitcoin is, but by paying people for work they did in their community that was valuable but wasn't profitable in the way that a corporation has to be profitable. But I think the solution is multiple currencies, so that people can buy the currencies and trade the currencies and use the currencies that make sense to them, because that transparent open market is what benefits all the users. So I would like to see a thing where there's a gold-backed currency, there's a labor-backed currency, there's Bitcoin, there's other alt currencies, there's fiat currencies issued by some government, there's a gold-backed currency, maybe a private gold-backed currency, right? Why does it have to be a government? If we could access a half a dozen currencies legally, then the ones that were losing value would be, people would stop using them and they would fail. And the ones that were working as stores of value and mediums of exchange would work. And so, and it's funny you mentioned printing money, because this was what was occurring in the early years of the United States. Is there wasn't enough gold and silver coinage for commerce, and so the local banks and states were issuing their own currencies. And so, why not go back to that system and see how it works? Because if we have an open market for currencies like we have an open market for anything else, everybody benefits.
Charles, thank you very much for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. Once again, how can people see your work?
Yeah, please visit me at of2minds.com. There's free sample chapters of all my books, so you can read a lot of my stuff for free.